this episode, we're going to take what you now understand about instance metadata and turn it into a calm, practical way to judge whether a cloud workload is protected against credential harvesting. The big idea is simple. If a compromised workload can reach the metadata service easily, and the metadata service can return usable credentials, then an attacker has a short path from a small foothold to broader cloud access. Hardening is the set of choices that lengthen that path, add friction, and reduce what the attacker can obtain even if they try. Beginners sometimes think hardening is a single switch you flip, but metadata hardening is usually a layered approach that involves the metadata endpoint itself, the workload's network behavior, and the permissions tied to the workload identity. Our goal is to help you assess those layers in a vendor-neutral way, so you can recognize safe patterns and risky gaps in any scenario. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good assessment starts by identifying what kind of harvesting path you are trying to block. Some harvesting paths are direct, meaning the attacker has code execution on the instance and can simply query metadata. Other harvesting paths are indirect, meaning the attacker can coerce an application into making requests on their behalf, such as through request forgery. Both paths end with the same outcome. The metadata service returns information, and the attacker gains access to it. The difference is how the attacker reaches the metadata endpoint. When you assess hardening, you want to ask how easy it is for untrusted input or untrusted code to reach that endpoint, and what the endpoint will provide if it is reached. This is calm because it turns a scary story into a small set of questions you can answer. One core hardening principle is to reduce metadata accessibility to only the code that truly needs it. In many designs, not every process on an instance needs to query metadata, and not every workload needs credential tokens from metadata. If an application does not need metadata, then the safest pattern is to prevent it from reaching metadata at all. That can be done through network controls inside the instance, host-based firewall rules, or application layer constraints that block requests to link local addresses. You do not need to know exact commands to understand the principle. Create a barrier so that untrusted parts of the system cannot talk to the metadata service. The assessment question is whether that barrier exists and whether it is enforced by default, not just documented as a best practice. If nothing blocks metadata access from application processes, then the environment is relying entirely on the assumption that the application will never be compromised. Another hardening principle is to require stronger request characteristics so that accidental or coerced requests do not succeed. A common harvesting pattern relies on the fact that metadata endpoints are simple to call, often just a basic web request, and a vulnerable application can be tricked into making that request. If the metadata service requires additional request properties, such as explicit headers or tokens that are not automatically included by generic fetch behavior, then the attack becomes harder. The reason is that many request forgery paths can force a simple request, but cannot reliably include the special attributes required by the metadata service. When you assess a scenario, ask whether metadata requests are protected by something beyond being local. If a basic request is enough to retrieve credentials, then many indirect harvesting paths remain viable. You also want to assess whether the metadata service is configured to limit what data can be retrieved, especially credentials. Some environments allow metadata access for non-sensitive information while restricting or disabling credential exposure through metadata. Even when credential retrieval is enabled, it might be restricted to certain versions or certain contexts. The assessment question is what the metadata service will return and how broadly it will return it. If an attacker can retrieve a token with a simple request, and that token has meaningful permissions, then you have a high-risk path. If metadata can be queried but returns only minimal non-sensitive details, the risk is lower, though you still consider reconnaissance value. A mature assessment does not treat metadata as all or nothing. It considers exactly what is exposed. Hardening also includes managing how applications handle outbound requests, because many metadata harvesting paths ride through legitimate application features. Any application that can fetch external resources, follow redirects, or proxy requests for users should be treated as a potential bridge to internal-only services. A strong pattern is to apply allow lists, restrict destinations, and block internal address ranges from user-influenced request features. The assessment question is whether the application has a way to fetch arbitrary URLs based on user input, and if so, whether it prevents access to internal addresses, including link local endpoints. You do not need to describe specific coding techniques to understand this. You just need to recognize that user-controlled request behavior is dangerous when internal services exist. If a scenario mentions a feature like importing content from a URL or fetching a remote image, your mind should immediately test that feature against metadata reachability. A related hardening layer is egress control, which means controlling what destinations workloads can connect to. People often think egress control is mainly about preventing data exfiltration to the internet, but it also matters inside the environment because it can restrict access to internal infrastructure services. If a workload's network rules prevent it from reaching the metadata address, then both direct and indirect harvesting attempts fail. Even if you cannot block all local traffic, you can often isolate sensitive management endpoints from general application subnets. The assessment question is whether network segmentation and egress policies align with the idea that only certain components should be able to access certain infrastructure endpoints. If every workload can reach everything, then a single compromise has a lot of pivot options, and metadata becomes one of the first pivots. Now connect metadata hardening to the principle of least privilege, because this is where the impact is either limited or amplified. Even the best metadata hardening can fail under some conditions, and your final safety net is limiting what any retrieve credential can do. If a workload identity has narrowly scoped permissions, then a stolen token may only allow low-impact actions. If a workload identity is broad or administrative, then a stolen token can be devastating. When you assess metadata hardening, you should always pair it with an assessment of permission scope, because those two together determine risk. A common gap is focusing on locking down metadata requests while leaving the instance identity overprivileged, which creates a situation where any failure becomes catastrophic. A COM assessor does not bet everything on a single barrier. Another important part of assessment is credential lifetime and refresh behavior, because metadata-based tokens are often temporary and renewable. Temporary credentials are better than static credentials in many ways, but they can still be used for the duration of their validity, and if an attacker can keep querying metadata, they can often keep renewing access. That means the question is not only how long a token lives, but whether an attacker can repeatedly harvest new tokens. If metadata access is unrestricted, an attacker can maintain cloud API access as long as they maintain foothold on the instance. If metadata access is restricted, harvesting becomes a one-time opportunity at best, or may be blocked entirely. Your assessment should therefore consider whether metadata is reachable continuously, and whether there are controls that prevent repeated token retrieval. You should also assess how the environment detects metadata harvesting attempts, because prevention is ideal, but detection reduces dwell time. If a workload starts making unusual numbers of metadata requests, or if the workload identity begins making unusual API calls shortly after metadata access, that pattern can be a signal of compromise. Mature environments treat metadata access and token usage as events worth monitoring, not just background noise. The assessment question is whether metadata-related activity would be visible to defenders and whether it would trigger investigation. Beginners sometimes think detection is only for external traffic, but internal misuse of metadata can be the earliest sign that something is wrong. If a scenario mentions strong monitoring and alerting around identity use, that should influence your risk judgment. Hardening assessment also includes thinking about workload design choices that reduce reliance on metadata in the first place. If a system can avoid needing credential tokens from metadata by using alternative authentication patterns, then the metadata harvesting path becomes less valuable. Even when metadata is used, designs can minimize the permissions of the workload identity so that credentials are less powerful. The assessment question is whether the architecture treats metadata credentials as high-value secrets that must be protected, or whether it treats them as convenient and harmless. Systems that treat metadata access casually tend to accumulate risk because developers may expose request features, grant broad roles, and never reconsider the threat model. Systems that treat metadata as sensitive tend to build guardrails around it early, which is a sign of maturity. A useful way to make this exam ready is to develop a small mental checklist you can apply quickly to any prompt. First, ask whether the workload can reach metadata and whether anything blocks that access from untrusted code or user-influenced requests. Second, ask whether metadata requests require special properties that reduce request forgery risk or whether any basic request succeeds. Third, ask what metadata can return, especially whether it can return credentials, and whether that is restricted. Fourth, ask what the retrieved credentials could do, which is a least privilege question about blast radius. Finally, ask what visibility exists for metadata access and for unusual API usage by the workload identity. This checklist stays vendor neutral and keeps you focused on risk logic rather than memorizing platform quirks. As we close, assessing metadata service hardening is about evaluating how many layers stand between an attacker and credential access, and what happens if one layer fails. The strongest posture reduces metadata reachability, requires stronger request characteristics, limits what metadata can return, and pairs all of that with tightly scoped workload permissions. It also treats unusual metadata and identity behavior as something that should be visible and actionable for defenders. The weakest posture assumes that local-only endpoints are automatically safe, allows applications to fetch arbitrary URLs without restriction, and grants workload identities broad privileges that turn any token into a master key. If you can calmly apply these assessment ideas to a scenario, you will be able to identify whether credential harvesting paths are blocked, merely discouraged, or quietly wide open.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.